Have you ever realized that different churches do the Holy Communion? They take the Holy Communion differently. You'll find out that some churches take a small cup of whether it is juice they're using or whatever it is, and a small piece of bread or whatever it is that they're using, and they take that as the Holy Communion. While some other churches, they take an entire meal, like an entire meal on a plate, and a drink on a cup, a drink that is full on a cup, whatever it is that they are using, and they take that as the Holy Communion. Now you might be wondering, why do these churches, where does the difference come from? Now let's go back to the scripture to know how this difference came to be from in Matthew chapter 26, from verse 17 all the way to verse 30. This is where it talks about the Passover, and it talks about the Lord's Supper, also known as the Holy Communion. Now, when you read from verse 17, Matthew 26 from verse 17, you will see this is where Jesus wanted to celebrate the Passover. If you don't know what the Passover feast is, it is when the angel of the Lord came to Egypt and he passed over the houses of Israel, of the Israelites, who had the blood splattered on their door, so that he would not kill their firstborn. But on the Egyptian side, he killed all the firstborn children of the Egyptians, including Pharaoh's child. And on the next day, of course, is when they were set free from captivity, from slavery, and they went into the promised land. Now that is the Passover feast that they are celebrating. So when you read from verse 17, it talks about from verse 17 all the way to verse 25. It talks about how Jesus instructs his disciples to find an upper room, so that, and for them to prepare a meal, an entire feast for them to celebrate the Passover, because this was a Jewish custom, the Passover feast. As they were eating the Passover feast, this is now where verse 26 begins. It says, "And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remissions of sins.'" Now, Jesus did this as a symbol that they should be doing this often. They should be doing this often. Now you might be wondering, why did he do this? Why did he do this? Why did he do this, especially in the middle of the Passover? The Passover was very, very, very important to the Jews. Why did he do this? Now one thing you have to remember is that they were taking the Passover in remembrance to God's judgment. That night God's judgment was seen upon the Egyptians. And so, when Jesus did this, he told them to do this in remembrance of him. What is this that he was saying? The Passover, the feast that they were having at the time. So that as they ate, now they would not remember God's judgment. They would not do it in remembrance of God's judgment, but they would do this in remembrance of the mercy and grace of God. When you read 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 26, it says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Now what is the Lord's death? The Lord's death is the grace and mercy of God towards human beings. Now they were supposed to be taking this supper not in remembrance of God's judgment, but in remembrance of his grace and mercy of God. So yeah, some of the churches, they interpreted this as taking that bread which he took and taking a small cup which he did take as cup, a small drink. And actually from that cup, the disciples, they shared that drink that was in that specific cup. But other churches, they interpreted it, the Passover feast being changed into the Lord's Supper. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 from verse 17, Paul was very angry with the Corinthians. He was scolding them on the order and the manner in which they use to take the Holy Communion. Not in the amount of food that they use, but in the manner in which they used in order to take the Holy Communion. And I'll prove this to you. When you read 1 Corinthians chapter 11 from verse 21, it says, "For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others." Meaning that other people had already started eating and others were already in the line waiting to be served. And it says, "And one is hungry and another one is drunk." Meaning as someone else is almost finishing his food, another one has not yet taken his food, and another one is drunk. Meaning the manner in which that they were using to take the Lord's Supper was not acceptable. The manner, not the amount of food that they were using, the manner. And it says from verse 22, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you in this. So Paul was actually angry at them in the manner, in the order and manner in which they were using in order to take the Lord's Supper, not the amount of food that they were using. And he actually tells them in verse 26, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So the Holy Communion is meant to remind us of the Lord's death, meaning his mercies and grace towards human beings. So yes, the Passover feast was changed into the Lord's Supper so that you do not focus on God's judgment, but on his mercy and grace. Thank you and God bless.